All right, I think we are live. Good evening, everyone. Thank you for tuning in. Before we begin, I would like to make everyone aware of the closed captioning services and ASL interpreters we have available for this discussion. Tonight, our ASL interpreters are Nicole Cartagna, a Mediterranean olive-skinned woman with short, dark hair, maroon top, and light blue background, and Jody Prysock, a white woman with salt and pepper hair, pulled back, black top, and tan curtains for background. Closed captioning can be found through an external link that is pinned to the top of the comments section and in the description of Facebook Live. This link will take you to an external page where captioning services will be provided both in English and in Spanish. With that said, good evening, everyone. My name is Nick E. Smith, and I'm proud to serve as First Deputy Public Advocate and the moderator for tonight's discussion. I am a Black male, dark skin, short hair, dark shirt, gray suit, and I'm sitting in front of a white background. Our office wanted to put this conversation together and this series together to take a much louder stance in our advocacy and outreach efforts to the disability community. We've taken actions in the past, including introducing legislation to establish a digital inclusion officer at every city agency and providing tenants with disabilities with information about legal services when facing eviction and reporting any pattern of discrimination against disabled tenants. We want to provide a space for this community to have a voice and express needs that must be met. When I talk about the disability community, I want to emphasize how diverse this community is. This includes individuals with vision impairments, deaf or hard of hearing, or neurodivergent, or who have mental health conditions, intellectual disabilities, acquired brain injuries, physical disabilities, chronic illness, and others that I may not have mentioned. We begin this first discussion this evening with invited panelists that I'm about to introduce because of the work we've done with them in the past. We asked them to share their experiences and the work they have done within the community. We acknowledge that these panelists represent only a portion of the community. And before I introduce these panelists, I want to thank all that have helped put this series together, including Adil Mishal, Muriel Clifford, Chanel Mellish, Isabella Sadej, Wesley Paisley, and Josinia Dominguez. And Muriel would like to say a few words before we begin. Muriel, you have the floor.
Hi, everyone. Thank you so much, Nick. My name is Muriel Clifford. I'm the digital media specialist here at the Office of the Public Advocate. I use she, her pronouns. And a visual description of myself for folks who are watching who are visually impaired. I'm a white woman with long blonde hair. I'm wearing red glasses and a white blouse. And I have 2 windows and a plant behind me in the background. So in addition to my work at the Public Advocate's Office, I also recently started a Disability Studies master's degree at CUNY through CUNY School of Professional Studies, which is an incredible program. So I was inspired to pursue disability studies because I'm a hard of hearing individual, and my experience with disability, chronic illness, and mental health issues just in my friends and family. And so another real catalyst for me pursuing disability studies was learning about the social model of disability, which I believe we're going to discuss tonight. And the social model of disability says that, it's really society that causes disability through barriers. So through, barriers that are attitudinal or cultural or related to policy. That's what disables people. And so learning about the social model allowed me to reframe my hearing loss and my family and friends experience in a really liberating way. So for that reason, I'm really excited about this conversation series that will be focused on eliminating barriers for New Yorkers. And in closing, I'm honored to be part of a staff that is re-envisioning public safety in general and community for all bodies and all minds in New York City. And I'm really excited to see the directions that will go in after this series. And thank you so much to the panelists and to my colleagues for making this event possible. Thank you and have a great conversation.
Thank you so much, Muriel. And we want to thank you and all of our team members for the work that you put in to help us conceive of this and put it together. My initial thought when I approached the staff regarding the session was it's very clear that all of us, no matter where we sit in life, must do a better job of living our lives in a way that is inclusive of all of our experiences, including those with disabilities. For many years, we've seen a city government, a state government, and a federal government fail to meet the challenge. And that is absolutely just plain and simply not acceptable, especially in an era where we're much more attuned to the idea of equity, which our mandate is to push for. So I'm glad that the Office of Public Advocate is again having this conversation and going to push for real, actionable, concrete solutions. So with that said, let's briefly introduce our panelists. We'll give each one about a minute, and then we'll jump into the questions. And let's start with my friend, who actually, to give him some credit, spoke to me about 6 to 9 months ago about, doing some of this stuff. And I'm very happy that he could join this conversation. That's Quemuel Arroyo. You have the floor.
Thank you so much, Nick. And thank you to you and the team at the Public Advocate's Office. You guys are really doing the work that needs to be done. I'm thrilled to be part of this conversation. Again, my name is Quemuel Arroyo. I go by Q. I use he, him, his pronouns. I am a Latino male with a white shirt on, curly hair pulled back into a ponytail, sitting in front of my windows showcasing Harlem, New York. I am in transportation tech. I work in technology right now at a company called Charge, where we deploy charging stations for electric scooters around the world so that they're not cluttering the streets and creating inaccessible paths of travel for pedestrians. Before that, I was the Chief Accessibility Specialist at the New York City Department of Transportation, where I oversaw policy for mobility and accessibility citywide.
Thank you so much, Quemuel. It's good to see you. And I should have mentioned you're the global head of community at Charge when I introduced you. Let's introduce Marc Fliedner, disability rights lawyer for Disability Rights New York. Marc, you have the floor for the introduction.
Hello, everybody. So glad to be here. I am Marc Fliedner. I'm a white male, he, him, his. I'm sitting at my desk in my home office wearing a jacket and tie that have some green with a nod to the holidays, and I have 2 Christmas stockings hanging behind me. I am the director, the New York City-based director of Disability Rights New York, and specifically the director of 2 programs there. One that addresses the legal advocacy needs of folks with mental illness, and also the needs of everybody who has any kind of a physical disability. And Disability Rights New York is the protection and advocacy organization for the state of New York. Every state has one. We're it for you all. And I am so grateful to the Public Advocate's Office for this being the first in a series of conversations about the needs of New York residents with disabilities.
Thank you so much, Marc, and we're happy to have you on the panel. Let's go to Elisabeth Axel, who is the founder and CEO of Art Beyond Sight and the co-chair of Project Access for All. And we thank her for her invaluable insight on setting up this panel and everything she's done for the disability community and all of us as well. Elisabeth?
Nick, thank you for including me, and the team at the project at the Public Advocate's Office is just amazing. It's delightful to be working with you all. I am a 55-year-old brown-haired white woman who is wearing a turquoise shirt and a yellow hairband. I am seated in front of white walls where my office files rest on a ledge above a ballet bar. And about Art Beyond Sight, we support emerging, disabled, future leaders of the cultural industry whose creativity leverages disability unity and power. We address barriers to inclusion from multiple stakeholder vantage points, igniting systemic change in disability inclusion and access. And Project Access for All, which I co-chair, is a community consortium of stakeholders from the disability community as well as non-disabled allies.
Thank you so much again, Elisabeth. Another one of our longstanding friends, let's introduce him, Mike Schweinsburg, the president of the 504 Democratic Club. Mike, you have the floor for your introduction.
Thank you kindly. So I respond to he, him, and his. I am older than Elisabeth and have long brown hair. I wear glasses. I'm wearing a light gray shirt. I have the benefit of blue pillows stacked behind me for my back. And there's a painting on a white wall. The 504 Democratic Club is the nation's first and largest advocating for the civil rights of people with disabilities. Another aspect I'd like to point out is that we have become nonpartisan. Too many of our leaders, are in other political parties, and we don't want to lose their voice in the struggle. So we have just 2 years ago changed our application to ensure that anybody who wants to join in the fight for disability rights has a home at the 504 Democratic Club. Thank you kindly.
Thank you so much, Mike. And just for point of clarity, and this isn't counter Mike at all, but we are in fact running this program through the Office of Public Advocate, so we're not actually partisan, but I think Mike made it clear that he also is approaching the work from a nonpartisan lens. So thank you so much, Mike. We appreciate that. Okay, so we are going to actually jump right into the questions. Audience, you should know that we have about 5 guiding questions, but we want to hear from you as well. So we have team members who are monitoring Facebook Live. And so if during the discussion, you're so moved to ask a question of any of the experts that you're going to hear from, drop your question into the Facebook Live chat, and then we will bring those questions up when they come in that segment. So let's go to the first broad question, and I'm curious to hear from our experts on the panel. Let's start here. What is a disability, and what misconceptions exist about what it means to have a disability? Anyone can jump in to answer that first set of questions. Thank you so much.
Nick, I'll take a stab answering part of that. And as we already heard from Ariel, the social versus the medical model of disability is crucial in understanding who is a disability community, because for too long, the disability community has been defined by the individual with a medical condition or a disability, who is seen as a patient, someone who needs services and receives them from the medical field, when in reality, the disability community is much broader than that. It's everybody who has a disability, but it's also the circles around them, their friends, their family members. Yes, they're caregivers, but also their coworkers. They're people that they vacation with and do fun activities with. So the disability community is vast. To get down to the numbers, however, in America, about 57 million Americans with disabilities walk amongst us. And here in New York City, about 10% of the population is known to have a disability, which we know it's a lowball number, because not everyone discloses their disability, which gets us to the second point of the many, many people with disabilities that go by unseen because they might have an invisible disability that's not visibly to the eye or perceived when you look at someone.
Great, thank you, Quemuel. Anyone else can jump in on that question, and or what are some misconceptions about what it means to have a disability?
Well,
Hey, Marc.
as the lawyer, this is Mark, I probably should weigh in. I like Q's definition much better than the legal definition, but I also, for frame of reference, should probably provide it. If we follow the Americans with Disabilities Act definition, and that utilized in the Section 503 of the Rehabilitation Act of 1973, it is a physical or mental impairment that substantially limits one or more major life activities. And the reason why I like Q's definition better is because it sounds much more dynamic and much more like the life that we want folks to lead. And I also think that the terms physical or mental are not really inclusive enough, because they don't have us tending to think of things like traumatic brain injury and intellectual or developmental disabilities. And so I wish we could meld the two, but I also think it's important to have the background that we lawyers have to deal with when we're representing the rights of folks with disabilities.
You know, I want to expand on that, Marc, because I'd be remiss if I didn't talk about this in this question, Nick, about who is the disability community and what defines us. You know, I myself am a New Yorker with a disability, but I am also a cyclist with a disability. You know, I am a sailor who sails on the Hudson and around the world with a disability. I ride horses, I skydive, I'm a deep sea diver. And so many people would be shocked to hear that. They'd say, nah, show me some pictures, and I'd be happy to. But the reality is that, you know, we, the disability community, we're everywhere. We walk amongst you, we live amongst you, and people don't think about that, you know, that a person with a disability has something to contribute to society, to the environment. But beyond that, that there are also people who like to go out and grab a beer after a long day at work.
Yep, thank you, Q. Elisabeth and Mike, you want to jump in on that one?
I'm jumping in on the beer, but I think they all said that so well.
Great. Okay.
Likewise. I mean, you guys covered it all. Thank you kindly.
Absolutely. So this is kind of a part, well, I guess it's a part C, and it could be an awkward question. So if I ever ask a question that is ill-formatted, let me know. But when it comes to describing the disability community, how should we identify a member of the community? Do we say a member of the disability community? Because there's been, I've seen some talk that, you know, different terms are used that are inappropriate. So does anyone want to talk about how we should describe a member of the disability community?
I would first say that there are labels that we prefer you not use. Handicap, do not use. Differently able, please don't use that. We are disabled and proud of it. You can refer to us as people with disabilities or disabled person. No one need shy away from our disability, our disabled label. We're quite happy and proud to do that. In fact, I organized New York City's first Disability Pride Parade in 2015, marking the 25th anniversary of the ADA. And remember, joking with the commissioner, we had monthly meetings, and every month he'd say, Mike, be happy if 500 to 800 people show up for this thing. And I said, Commissioner, be prepared for 5,000 people to show up. And 5,000 people showed up. So disabled is the way we like to be referred to.
Nick, I could jump in on that as well. You know, we're a vast community. We're very diverse. We're intersectional. We come from all backgrounds and all communities. And we're also diverse in our disabilities and how we like to be called, just like many other communities culturally have different ways they like to be named. So for instance, some people in the deaf community do not consider themselves to be part of the disability community. And when it is that so some people write deaf and disabled people, right? Some people with disabilities prefer that we use people first language, a person with a disability, and some people prefer disability first language. Overall, I think the thing that we all can agree upon is that disability or the deaf community is a culture and communities. And just like any other community, we require that people understand cultural competencies in engaging with us.
Thank you, Elizabeth. And I'm glad we were able to go through that particular question because it's a good foundational question going forward, particularly in the upcoming questions. So let's talk about barriers. What are some barriers facing New Yorkers with disabilities, and what are the potential solutions to overcoming them? And that again is a very broad question, Elizabeth, as you're getting at. There's a vast diversity, but from your perspectives, how would you describe barriers facing New Yorkers with disabilities from again from your perspective?
So we are the largest minority, but we are also the poorest minority due to employment barriers. A national survey was conducted by the Kessler Foundation following the outbreak of COVID, which showed that in the early months of the pandemic, the disability community suffered a 20% rate of job loss versus a 14% drop for the non-disabled. We need a New York City survey to be undertaken, as we have indicators that show that the ratio is much worse here. Some of the only good news to come from the crisis is that remote working, the formerly titled unreasonable accommodation, for decades we were told, no, you cannot do that effectively. But now, of course, it's been proven to be among the very best business practice. And I'd just like to say, with regard to COVID recovery, from an economic standpoint and relating to employment, as we look through the recovery plan, people with disabilities should not be left further behind.
Thank you, Mike. And I actually want to stick there just for a second, and I want others to answer, but I want to stick on the point you just mentioned, which is striking. The fact that for many years, folks have been recommending remote work options, and now because of this pandemic, this health crisis, it's now, what is the best way to put it, in fashion or acceptable. Can you just speak to that a bit more in terms of like reframing it as a barrier, and how our corporate leaders, I think you're talking about the private sector or public sector or both, how those employers are catching up to a space where we probably should have been decades ago? Can you just talk about that a little more?
Well, I'd like to see evidence that they're actually catching up. I think that we have to put measures out there that ensure that they do. What I'm saying is that in decades past, we've always asked for flex time, part-time, or remote working, and been told continually as a dodge that no, that's an unreasonable accommodation. They can't dodge that any longer. So we, need to make businesses aware. And let me say this: that in 2010, President Obama signed an executive order setting an aspirational hiring target of 7% within all federal agencies and their supply chains. When he left office, he had accomplished a 14.41% hiring level. Unfortunately, the current administration reversed that executive order. I would say that New York City should codify that goal by passing a law that calls for a 7% aspirational hiring target, not a quota, applicable to all branches of government, the executive, the legislative, and the judicial, as well as all contractors and subcontractors. While not a quota in any way, the legislation should include provisions that mandate periodic reporting from all above named on progress or setbacks. Assemblymember Harvey Epstein and a Senate colleague, Senator Skoufis, have introduced bills in their chamber calling for this 7% hiring target across all agencies of state government. And Majority Whip Kevin Parker has vowed to push it through the Senate. The public advocate can show New York City agencies that disability must be included in the diversity conversation. Disability should be part of the protected class in New York City, in addition to women and minority communities. This would push forward the disability lens in all city activities, with the Public Advocate's Office, again, taking the role as a leader in furthering equality for New York City's marginalized communities. This will open employment opportunities, certainly for people with disabilities. Finally, any New York City legislation, should be another bill put forward, that any New York City legislation should be viewed first through a disability lens. A few years ago, we had the ban on plastic straws that fell apart because they didn't take into account that many people with disabilities, when they're outside their home, need those flexible straws, plastic straws. You can't make a flexible metal straw. They needed that. And so that's, the failure there was not to look at what the needs of the disability community were before introducing that law. So making disabled people a protected class will help facilitate this, I believe.
Thank you, Mike. Any colleagues want to jump in on the panel on that?
Elisabeth?
Well, Mike knows that I have a lot to say on this employment issue. Art Band Site has been working for about 3 years with the National Endowment for the Arts, researching and creating a toolkit for people with disabilities to find stability as artists and cultural workers. In this toolkit, we are addressing the pipeline to employment as well as barriers to employment from the perspective of employers, educators, people with disabilities themselves, and funders. What we've learned is that it is key that employers and funders see the disability community as part of underrepresented communities. As we envision New York City 2.0, New York City post-COVID, we need to rehire for positions lost during COVID with diversity in mind. Additionally, COVID has initiated a new wave of job accessibility for people with disabilities by broadening the scope of virtual work and remote positions. As Mike said, we hope some elements of this access attitude in the workplace will continue into the post-COVID future. The Public Advocate's Office could be instrumental in diversity, including disability, nationally and in New York City, for most funders and human resources professionals, it just does not. The disability motto is nothing about us without us. In fact, I have only been able to find to date 2 grant makers who self-identify as people with disabilities. Project Access Disability Unite is calling for data collection about the impact of COVID on the disability community. This is crucial information to aid recovery efforts and direct vital resources to the areas it's needed most. If we look historically, even prior to the onset of COVID, the city has needed to seek more detailed disability statistics. A past diversity study conducted by the New York City Department of Cultural Affairs documented a statistically insignificant number of disabled people working in cultural institutions in New York City. And that's simply unacceptable. I believe this number could be greatly increased if the Department of Cultural Affairs took steps to ensure that people with disabilities are comfortable to self-identify. Funders do not fund communities or projects when there is no baseline data point. Funders need to be brought into this conversation so they will also be invested in the solution, and funders need to include disabled people themselves. Imagine if the Department of Cultural Affairs lived by the 7% aspirational hiring of people with disabilities that Mike just talked about. Imagine what our disability employment numbers would look like if Department of Cultural Affairs required grantees to hire within the disability community for grant-funded projects, with that aspirational number in mind, both in staffing and in procurement policy. Because of privacy concerns and continuing social stigma, disability status is usually not collected. But imagine if we can change the paradigm where cultural organizations are seeking people with disabilities to hire because they know this is a priority of the funder. Lack of ASL for the deaf community, captioning, audio description are major barriers to participation, both in person and for online engagement, not only in the arts, but society in general. These basic accommodations require funding, and this funding should be prioritized by the city. The areas where the city gives funding, the Department for Cultural Affairs is a great place to start. Commissioner Gonzalo Casals lives and breathes diversity and inclusion. Commissioner Casals, the arts can lead the way. Do we know not only how many museums had access programs pre-COVID, but also how many ASL tours they offered each month? How many theater performances for the autism community were there pre-COVID? If we know these numbers, will Department of Cultural Affairs Commissioner Casals and other funders make funding opportunities for grantees to return to pre-COVID access program rates? This is, as they say, low-hanging fruit, easy equity to push forward. And how might we be proactive in preserving virtual work opportunities across the arts and cultural sectors for those access barriers to workplaces? Access as an attitude has had to prevail throughout 2020, as access has suddenly become a relevant issue for the able-bodied population. We hope to nourish this accessible attitude from the inside by ensuring that disabled voices are represented in the institutional workplace. And I apologize to my panelists and to Nick that I have gone on and gotten emotional, but it's very rare, Nick, that any government agency actually asks, how can we advocate for you? And so I felt I just need to pour it all out and dream the dream of what so many people have expressed to me and that I believe myself.
Elisabeth, there's no need to apologize. We are literally doing this work because one, it must be done. And our mission mandate is truly about equity. And so it is our partnership with you, Marc, Mike, Q, and others that I know will make our days a little bit brighter. So I appreciate your comments so much, Elisabeth. Thank you for that. And Marc, as a fellow lawyer, I know sometimes we get called to give us, what is the law on X issue without realizing that, we're not just equipped to just talk about law. We bring to it sometimes our experiences, or we talk about narrative. So I'm going to ask you in a way that sounds a little dry, but I do want you to feel free to expound as needed, particularly if you have any personal experience, if you're comfortable sharing, or if there are clients that you are comfortable talking about, et cetera. So the question is, what protections in the law currently exist?
Well, first of all, I loved everything that my fellow panelists and you, Nick, have been saying about why New York City needs to be the place for significant change to start. Because among other protections, the New York City human rights law is, I'm going to say, arguably the most expansive human rights law in the world. And that provides lawyers and those who are impacted by discrimination and by a failure to get access to what they're entitled to as people with disabilities to be heard because of the expansiveness of that law. For example, the New York City, a lot of what Mike's addressed and what everybody on the panel is acutely aware of is the failure of employers and landlords and other entities in the city to provide the legally mandated reasonable accommodations for folks. And for example, the New York City human rights law is unique in that it says that if such an employer does not participate, actively engage in a dialogue about reasonable accommodations that will make Mike every bit as capable of performing the job and probably better than anybody else, then that in and of itself is a violation of the human rights law. So it provides an opening to address a lot of wrongs. There are so many things that the panelists have spoken to that are the kinds of things that I see every single day working with clients. I think you asked what kind of barriers there are in the city, and obviously we know we have the barriers with transportation and all of these things, but there's a couple of barriers that I'd like to touch on, if you'll let me, that the law
Sure.
can protect us on.
Sure.
One of them is stigma. Particularly because I run a program that deals with folks with mental illness, they will lots of times say to me, but I don't know how my employer is going to respond if I ask for a reasonable accommodation for my mental illness, or it can be or my traumatic brain injury that somehow dictates my behaviors. But that's kind of playing into the stigma that we've got to avoid. I love the fact that Mike said he embraces the word disability. This is what 10% of our society, at least, right, deals with every day, and it's a component of their lives, and so we've got to stop stigmatizing it, because until we do, we can't educate all of those folks that are woefully uneducated about the needs of folks with disabilities. Another thing, and this is a soapbox that folks on the panel probably have heard me talk about before, is when I started to look before the pandemic at what the nation, state, and city were prepared to do with regard to emergency preparedness as it relates to folks with disabilities, I was shocked. Like everybody else, you start with Google, right? And you start to see that there are these conversations after Sandy about how folks with disabilities, primarily physical disabilities, who are trapped in the flooding and things like that, were impacted. And there's a robust conversation for a few months, and then it stops. Needless to say, it should never have stopped, and it cannot stop going forward. To echo a sentiment that Liz put very well, people with disabilities are the first to be impacted in any kind of a city crisis. And they're the last people to be given a place at the table when emergency preparedness protocols and procedures are adopted. It's so wrongheaded, and it's so easy to fix. And frankly, this kind of a forum and this kind of a commitment by the public advocate to make sure that we prioritize these things properly is key to us getting it right going forward.
Absolutely. Thank you so much, Mark. And actually, I should really talk about the public advocate's legislative record in terms of those protections. And you just actually pointed to one of the laws that we passed about a year and a half ago as public advocate, which outlaws retaliation against workers who ask for a reasonable accommodation for religion, medical issue, or disability. So we've literally taken action in this administration to move the ball forward. And I will also add, there's been a bunch of, since I've been working with the public advocate when he was a council member, and when I was in the mayor's office as well, working with him and other council members in terms of Germani, he's worked to expand the human rights law in many areas. So when we talk about disability, or women suffering, or people, including women, suffering from domestic violence, or people who may have a criminal record. So we've spent years trying to move the ball forward. And so I'm really glad that you talked about the reasonable accommodation, really ban on retaliation. And that is really why we're having these forums, to one, again, raise awareness, and to look at concrete solutions. So you and Mike and Elisabeth and Q talking about those needs is, to me, right on the money. So Marc, thank you for that. We really appreciate it.
Listen, and I'm informed by the conversations with the other panelists and the clients that we serve every day. I'll take one opportunity, since you're giving it to me, to say that this very moment in time is a critical example. We are now, just in the last few days, talking about distribution of the vaccines, right? And part of that is to be categorizing who should be getting them first. But people with disabilities are not being recognized at the national level and to some extent at the state level as the folks that are so critically in need of these vaccines. Folks with disabilities are very disproportionately impacted by exposure to the virus. We're focusing on the locations where people reside, which is great, and a lot of those folks are people with disabilities, but we're not talking about the people with disability in the community who are also in need of that priority. And sadly, state agencies like OPWDD and the Department of Health have not been playing a leadership role in saying that we need to define things in those terms in this very moment in time.
Thank you for that, Marc. Anyone want to add to that before we go to the next guiding question? Okay. The next question we have is, how does the government and the private sector fail to respond to these populations' needs? Again, a broader question, but I know all of you have answers to this one.
You know what, Nick, I'll take a stab there because we were talking a little bit about COVID. And I think before we go into all the ways that the private sector and government fails us, I think we'd be remiss if we didn't talk about the ways that COVID has brought an opportunity for people to do better now that we do know better. And we see that at the MTA with Victor Khaleesi, bringing in the conversation about persons with disabilities, really heightening the need for an accessible transit. But even beyond that, Mike touched upon this earlier when we were talking about reasonable accommodations and working from home, which now, the theory of productivity has been debunked. And the disability community has been asking for this for decades. And now everyone is in on, yeah, I can be productive by working from home. Where we don't lose by having me being able to perform in the way that I can in my environment. But beyond that, a lot of the conversations that were had that had become siloed around the disability community are now expanded. And I'm talking about particularly here, transportation and accessible transportation becoming micro, and accessibility being looked through the lens of your community. Now that people aren't riding the subway as much, unfortunately, but people are working from home. So their transportation is to and from their local groceries, to and from, their food pantry in their communities. That means that issues like curb ramps, sidewalks, accessibilities, inaccessible paths of travels have all been now heightened and are equally distributed amongst all pedestrians. And everyone cares about the accessibility of their sidewalks, their streets. So that's something that we've seen that as a positive that I hope the city continues to lead with. While I was at DOT, we settled the landmark lawsuit on accessibility in transportation, accessible paths of travel, curb ramps, and that focus shouldn't go away, because now everyone is out there walking. There are a lot more pedestrian activities, and we need to really debunk that a curb ramp is just for a person with a disability. That accessible sidewalks benefit everyone. And hopefully at some point get to talking about accessible public restrooms, which you have all over Europe, not, very rarely. I think we have about 4 in the outer boroughs here in the city. But these are all issues that were once, only spoken within the disability community that have now gotten the limelight and are spoken all over the place.
Great, thank you, Q. Anyone else on that?
Well, I would just like to make a brief mention about the deficits in education. The District 75 schools, while It's a unique program. I understand it's not found in every city in the country, but I'm trying to be kind, to a degree inadequate, because they don't seem to have the right mixture of teachers and paraprofessionals. The right teacher or the right paraprofessional can make all the difference in whether that student succeeds or not. A close friend of mine who has cerebral palsy said that what got him through elementary school and high school were the right professionals. He didn't have a lot of respect for all his teachers, but he was able to go on to university. And there we have another problem. Our city and state universities and private universities are just not funded correctly. The funding from the state, and this is not really a city solution, although perhaps it could be from CUNY, but given inflation, the funding has not risen since 1992. But with advancements in medicine and everything else, and the internet for students with disabilities to self-teach, has meant a vast increase in students with disabilities going on to higher education. The funding has not followed, and that is really sad. I can't imagine any other minority not reacting to that in a very forceful way.
Yeah, Mike, your camera's off too. I'm not sure if you turned it off or if there's a connection issue.
How did I turn? Uh-oh, what do you mean?
We can't see you. We can hear you though.
Well, that's good, but I don't know how to do anything better than what I've done.
Okay.
I mean, I don't know what happened there. I don't know what, I just saw that I went off the screen, but I'm afraid I'm going to have to be a voice. Look at technology has most often failed me.
No problem.
Right. Okay.
No problem.
You asked
There
me
you
to
go.
start it.
We can see
That's
you.
how we did it, Nick.
There
You
you
asked
go.
me to start it. I said, okay. And here I am.
Okay, Mike, thanks so much. We can see you now. All right, cool. Anybody else on the question of government or private sector failing to respond to population needs? And if not, we'll go to the next question.
Well, I could say that kind of referring to Mike's camera being off and on, to the credit of government, the New York City Mayor's Office for People with Disabilities did an amazing job in terms of weekly telephone calls with our community, the disability community, during COVID. And one of the things that was at stake here is being a poor community. Many people didn't have internet access, and trying to figure out how to deal with even basics like food, where it is that people were being required to go online in order to get access to the city food programs, you know? So there are instances where, Nick, the Mayor's Office for People with Disabilities really stepped up for the community, in my opinion, during COVID. And those weekly phone calls of communication continue. And yet there are systemic barriers to inclusion that exist. And I kind of think that it all keeps coming down to funding. You know, why is there a lack of funding? That's a very big and very complicated issue. But lack of awareness and understanding about our community and a lack of data is what I think it boils down to. And so, you know, we need the city's partnership for data collection in order to drive awareness for these campaigns and be able to influence funders of all kinds, whether it's grants and foundations or corporate giving and individual donors, To help the public and private sectors meet our community needs, we need to provide them with the data that clearly articulates that need. If the Public Advocate's Office can join Project Access's Disability Unite initiative, we're trying to find creative ways to urge disabled people to self-identify. We need to change the paradigm that causes disabled people to feel concerned about sharing their disability status. We need to make ourselves known, and unless we remove the stigma behind disability, our community will never be able to do so. Second, again, I'm dreaming my wish list, Nick. I've got your ear, and it's
I don't mind.
and it's even documented live.
Right.
Also, if the Public Advocate's Office, you are in a unique position to lead the charge and call for disability status being added as an optional question on all New York City government forms. Without the question being present, our community cannot choose to self-identify. Just as other marginalized community numbers are key to funders granting money to recovery efforts for these communities, the disability community needs to have comparable data available so it's clearly shown that we've been disproportionately impacted by COVID and should receive support in recovery. This is an overarching need that impacts many other issues we've discussed today. New data is crucial as we round the corner in this pandemic and begin thinking about the new normal and what things could be like in terms of jobs for people with disabilities. Some of the only good news to come from the crisis is what we talked about with remote learning that had been titled unreasonable accommodation. But without real data, we're running the risk of implementing programs in a way that doesn't best suit the needs of approximately 1 in 4 New Yorkers. Newly reopened businesses and new businesses are in the perfect position to implement best practices for digital and physical accessibility so that we will benefit both their customers and employees, as well as their bottom line. Training should be available that instruct business owners as to how they can make their premises and operations accessible. Quite often, those remedies are relatively inexpensive and easy. And the Department of Buildings should add a checkbox on their application attesting to buildings compliance with the Americans with Disabilities Act.
All fantastic ideas. And as someone whose profession is legislation, among other things, you should know, Elisabeth, we're going to follow up on all these recommendations because, even though things may sound like common sense, sometimes things have a way of not moving forward, and that's not going to happen here. We do have to figure out if another member has a certain bill. It's a whole process, but we are going to follow up on the ideas that you mentioned this evening. So thank you for that. I want to let the audience know that we have 30 minutes left, and we are going to get to your questions in about 5 to 6 minutes. We have a couple more guiding questions, but we will get to some of your questions in just a couple of minutes. And let's go to 2 further guiding questions before the audience questions. So how should we live and work with an eye toward equity and inclusivity?
We've heard Elisabeth talk so much about this. We heard Mike give us very direct examples of what we need to see. But really, at the genesis of all of this, the gestalt of this issue is that when you create programs and services for your population with the highest needs, you are able to service everyone. And that's not been the principle that we've seen enacted by most of our legislators, unfortunately, and our people in government and in the private sector. When you see great programs like City Bike that expand transportation, that create new modes of transportation, still, you haven't seen one example of an accessible device getting a person with disability in the transit desert to their nearest subway stations. That lens of creating programs and services for those with the highest needs. And I'm not just saying this because I'm a person with a disability and I would benefit from that, but really it's so costly prohibitive to redesign a program, to retrofit. Whereas if you design with a disability, through the disability lens, you will hit all your stakeholders because you will have provided for those with the highest needs.
If
Thank
I
you,
may,
Yeah.
when I first met Q, it was around a table while we were planning that 25th, the Disability Pride Month events and outlook. At the time, he was working for the Department of Transportation. So I'm not the MC, but I'm going to ask Q to please expand on one of our greatest barriers, transportation.
You know, I will say something briefly, but the public advocates team is having a larger conversation on transportation and accessibility and the need. But I will say that, in my 6 years at DOT, Polly Trottenberg spearheaded a very aggressive agenda that included, not just included, it was really based on bringing access to those that were not served for so long, like tripling the number of accessible pedestrian signals that we installed citywide, which is still not enough, but it's a lot better than what we had before. We settled a landmark lawsuit for $7.5 billion to redesign the face of New York. I got to design a raised crosswalk, and we now have them in several of our boroughs throughout the city. We did so much for the disability community. We literally enhanced the streets of New York so that New Yorkers could get out of their homes on their own time and enjoy all that the city has to offer. That said, there's a lot of conversations about budget cuts and need and priorities. And we need people like Jamani and Nick to not let the disability agenda go into a desk, into a drawer, and be closed because of other priorities. Because remember what I just said, servicing the disability community hits everybody. It really addresses the senior populations, parents. There's over 130,000 births in New York City a year. And those are strollers that are going on in subways and stairs and escalators everywhere. There's so many businesses that are now going to have to redesign themselves. And in doing so, they can redesign themselves to not forget that the disability community has money. Our money's green just like everybody else's. And we have the power of investment, but we're only going to do that in places that we feel welcome. In my wheelchair, that is accessible to all our needs. And it will take government to shed light into the private sector so that together the disability community can get the services that we for so long have not been rendered. We have been taken out of circulation by our society, by businesses that don't provide to our community.
Thank you for that, Q.
Real fast?
Yeah, yes, of course. Go ahead, Marc.
I love your message of inclusion, and it's so consistent with the legal principles that we follow as lawyers who do civil rights work for folks with disabilities, that the integration of the community is the ideal. And I also would suggest that in this moment in time, we have an opportunity to also honor those who have been impacted directly by COVID-19, because we have many, many New Yorkers, many more New Yorkers that have disabilities because of their exposure to COVID-19, physical manifestations of the virus that will stay with them for the rest of their lives and that they have to accommodate, and also things like exacerbated post-traumatic stress disorder and things like that because of the isolation and all of the trauma that we've collectively experienced. And so this is an opportunity to, and of course, there's also the piece about the fact that individuals who with disabilities now have exacerbation of certain, pre-existing conditions because of the virus. So this is an opportunity to further enhance inclusion by making sure that this whole new group of folks is part of that process, and that the city recognizes that one of the results of the struggle that we've been through in the last several months, and it'll be a year plus, is one that has impacted New Yorkers and will impact them for the rest of their lives.
Great. Thank you for that, Marc. So there's an action question that we have, but I'm going to actually save that for last. I want to get to some of the audience questions, then we'll come back. And if there are questions that I ask that we don't have the answer to, the questioners, that we'll follow up with you after the panel. So this is about the New York City Campaign Finance Board. Why does the Campaign Finance Board give public money to candidates that do not have WCAG websites, usually provide poor quality captions, while making it hard to access ASL or open captions /CART? Why can't CFB run basic accommodations training for potential candidates and then request in the auditing that they're running accessible campaigns? And before anyone answers that, I do want to say we have a bill that is related in many ways to this topic. It's an Intro 1861. It would establish a digital inclusion officer at every agency. The bill also addresses visual accessibility for city websites, amending local law 26 of 2016 to mandate that city websites update to the latest version of web content accessibility guidelines, WCAG standards, as they're updated. But anyone can take that beyond that.
Whoever said that, rock on. That's an awesome point. That, it boils back to funding. If we're giving city funding, then it should be with the values of the city, and the city's values are inclusive. If you don't meet our inclusive standard, you shouldn't be getting the funding.
Elisabeth, you're spot on, but to bring it even to a deeper level, not only is it funding, but it's will. Because let's be real, the New York City budget, even in the 2020 budget in a year of crisis, it's over $85 billion. So it's hard for me to hear that the money isn't there to get at these wishes that should really be there from the beginning. But you see it in the best case scenarios where the law that Nick just alluded to, which kudos to Helen Rosenthal, Idanis and others who really pushed for it, Victor Calisi, still city government agencies who are now mandated to have accessible websites and all these things. There's one person at Do It that's responsible for all the city agencies' website. One person, and he's amazing. I love him. It is crazy to have that job. He's really set up for failure. It really tells a story that the city has not made this a priority. So many agencies coupled their disability service facilitator's role with the EEO officer role. Now, let's be real here. These are two very distinct jobs that each require a team of people. Now, we're lucky that we have one person. Now that one person does both, yes, we're doing it, but are we really doing it? And to the question about why there isn't training out there, I mean, forever I've been hoping that someone would look at the Department of Buildings and what their 500 plus inspectors do and why accessibility is not part of their training, their dialogue, or even a conversation piece there. I look at brand new buildings and they're inaccessible. And I think to myself, how are those people's parents going to come to visit them when they have a wheelchair or a temporary wheelchair? How is that woman that might be pregnant going to get her stroller in and out of that building when there's no accessible entrance? But beyond that, it tells the narrative about how we as a society take people with disabilities out of the conversation and out of society at large. And to that 13-year-old, that 3-year-old child with a disability, it tells them a story about their environment and their community and the places that they are not invited to participate in.
Q. Yep, go ahead. Yep.
It makes me think about other allied communities, right? And how they've created change and the type of mentorship, if you will, that they are recently giving to the disability community with Disability Unite, like the LGBTQ community with GLAAD or the Black Lives Matter community, right? It's a matter of, for instance, taking a look at city council members' social media. And if they're not alt tagged and they're not accessible to blind people, calling them on it, right? Because just like you said, Q, you're leaving out a part of your community. Do you care or you don't care?
Thank you for that. Let's see, I believe there was another question from the Facebook audience, and here it is. Why don't New York City statistics break out the types of disabilities? Lumping everyone, it says lumping everyone with the disability is extremely ableist and does not allow for policymakers to get a real picture of how many of us, for example, vision, mobility, or deaf, or hard of hearing people are in the city, or employed or unemployed. The stats for deaf blind persons are terrible.
I mean, at the root of that question is, where does this data come from in the first place? And who has access to the US Census, and who replies and who doesn't? How accessible is it really? And you know, you all be shocked to hear that when there's a crash on the roadway, NYPD fills out a form from the DMV that does not include questions on disability status. So we have projects like Vision Zero rolled out without any data on the disability community and how they're disproportionately faced by accidents around the city. We don't have data. You know, a lot of people have couched it as a safety concern and privacy issue. Really, technology is so advanced that we all know that this could be striped and privacy could be preserved. We haven't had anyone who said disability matters and we're going to get that data. We're going to collect that data. For me to get that data, working as a chief accessibility specialist at DOT, I had to go by hand, speaking to trauma 2 centers in New York City, in New York State, and find out how many people left the hospital with a disability. And that was as good as I can get it, because there is no one collecting that type of data here in the city.
Can I just add one point to that? Is that in the process, during the pandemic, we have Disability Rights New York and other advocacy partners have been trying mightily to get data that's relevant to what goes on in congregate care settings where folks with disabilities reside, or in some cases are detained against, you know, their wishes. And there's a lack of transparency about what goes on in these settings, and this is coming from our government sources of data information at the state level primarily. As a society, as a culture, we have to say this is unacceptable. We need to know who the folks were that were impacted, specifically what kinds of disabilities were impacted most, so that we can plan accordingly. And as long as there is an instinct to be less than transparent, there's a wall there, and we're not going to get past it. So,
Thanks. Any additional comments? And if not, we'll go to the final question of the evening, and then we'll go to closing statements. So any additional comments on that?
I jump in again, Nick,
Sure.
which is it's again understanding disability. The disability is a cultural competency. If you understand our community and you understand we have a variety of needs and preferences, then you understand why we don't want, while we are empowered together, but we do not want to be all lumped together. And again, you know, an educative moment, if people on the Facebook want to understand, want to know what to say and what to do, visit the New York City Mayor's Office for People with Disabilities website, because they're looked to by the rest of the nation. There are amazing resources there of what to know, what to say and do for different disability communities. And so, you know, I think one more piece about funding. We're going to be having a really big problem in the arts community, because funders now like to fund organizations that are above $250,000 a year. When you understand how disability arts goes, very often we have, let's say, a school that specializes for blind dancers, or a troupe that's made up of, you know, more wheelchair users, or the same thing in sports, right? These are not large organizations. The reason why they're not large organizations is because they were designed to meet the needs and preferences of a particular constituency. So this is really a post-COVID mess because the organizations are hanging on by a thread. So it boils down to me with data and understanding.
And what Elisabeth meant there, organizations that don't have an annual budget of at least 250,000 are in a really bad place to get any funding at all. Just to clarify that. But that's why the numbers matter, because unless people understand the magnitude and the breadth and depth of the disability community, we'll still be a marginalized group. We'll still be a silo, and the conversation will always come at the very end. What about the guys over there that are yelling because we haven't gotten to them yet? It'll always be an afterthought until we understand how big this population really is.
Well said, Q.
Right. And acknowledgement once again must be given to the fact that we are the poorest minority, and we are the poorest minority because of lack of employment opportunities. But I think there's also a tendency to shun any attempts at recognizing our needs with the assumption that there won't be a lot of voices, a huge chorus of voices that will come out and march and advocate and all of that. So it falls on leaders in the disability community, it falls on government to raise their voice, to show just how valuable we are, how big we are, and how much we can accomplish. Let me just touch on COVID recovery again, and from an economic standpoint, relating to employment, my hobby horse, right? People with disabilities should not be left further behind as we plan recovery. We spoke earlier about the job loss for our community that has risen above the non-disabled workers during the crisis. That has to be rectified. A broad acceptance of telecommuting should of course benefit disabled workers to restore at least the level pre-pandemic and dramatically increase opportunities. An important goal of the ADA was to create employment opportunities for disabled people, both through hiring standards and practices and accessibility, which would enable people with disabilities to access more workplaces. At the time of passage, the employment rate for people with disabilities was 30%, 30 years ago. And we are now actually in the 31st year of the ADA, and that rate is 33%. Elisabeth's point about ADA standards and enforcement is well taken, but we also must look to the Human Rights Commission, which should be granted more funding so they can pursue places where disparities and discrimination exist, and be able to put forth tougher compliance penalties for those who refuse to follow the standards. And at this point, I'd just like everyone to acknowledge an ugly truth. The lack of appropriate increases in employment since the ADA is due mostly to discrimination. We know this. Matched pair surveys, I believe, Marc, wasn't it DRNY that did the matched pair surveys? They've been conducted where a disabled person and a non-disabled person of equal qualifications go to interviews, and the disabled candidate is told the position is filled, and the non-disabled candidate goes further through the hiring process. If you'd like to expand on that, Marc, I'd really appreciate getting that word out, because in essence, what I say and what 504 says is we are blatantly discriminated against in terms of employment, education, housing, healthcare, whatever issue anyone wants to look at, the impact is far greater on disabled people. Go ahead, Mark. I'm sorry.
No, you're absolutely right. That's the kind of work that we're constantly doing and trying to do. We all have our resource challenges, but I have to say that it's an honor to be the one person on this panel that at this stage in my life, at this moment in my life, does not identify as a person with a disability. But I find working on civil rights challenges in the context of the community that is made up of people with disabilities has been, and I wasn't born yesterday. I've been doing this for a while. Has been the most gratifying, compelling, smart, interesting work that I've done. And any policymaker or community leader who takes the time to stop talking and listen will understand how compelling the need is. So, thank you.
Sure. Thank you, Mike. And thank you, Mark. So we are up to about 9 minutes left, and we have our final question. So we've actually touched on a lot of this, but I do want to put a tip on the spear, for lack of a better term, to make sure that we're all sort of honing in on those concrete recommendations. So the final question is, what legislation or practice changes need to occur to improve accessibility and equity? And Elisabeth, you talked about some earlier, but are there additional thoughts or other people have any recommendations? We're happy to talk about those at this point. Feel free.
Actually, let's marry what Mike was just speaking to and that point right there. Having been a person with a disability that's worked in corporate, that's worked in government, that's now in startup, I really do think that this root issue that Mike was alluding to will not change until we start employing people with disabilities. And why do I say that? Commissioner Khaleesi and I would always joke when I started at DOT, saying that I had to do whatever it took to make people at DOT comfortable with my disability and to help them see our issues through my lens. And what did that mean? He would say to me, you fall out of your chair if you need to fall out of your chair, and make a big joke about it. Let people laugh to make them comfortable, and then get them on a wheelchair, get them rolling through cobblestone, blindfold them so that they understand the experience. Because the unfortunate truth, Nick, is that we don't see the world as it is. We see the world through a very narrow lens as how we experience it. So even this panel, which you already addressed, is only speaking to a very small subset of the lived experience of the general population. So I would go back and say, hire people with disabilities, not only because they're the second largest group of Americans who are overeducated, underemployed, second to women of color, no surprise there, but we're qualified. All we need is for us to be given a seat at the table and an equal opportunity to interview. And until you do that, until we employ people with disabilities in all areas of life, in corporate, in government, at every city agency, these issues will never go away, because it'll always be a third party who may never have the experience or who doesn't have the understanding to take on this issue themselves and bring this fight to that boardroom, to that conversation table.
Well said, Q. Really well said. Thank you for that. Anyone else want to answer that as well?
I will only answer in terms of reiterating that a combination, I believe, of the two laws I proposed, we proposed, the 7% hiring solution and a law mandating that all future legislation be viewed through the disability lens is going to make the difference. Because what we know is that when the more folks become familiar with people with disabilities, intimately familiar, see them every day, the more aware they become that we're just as capable, we're just as intelligent, if not more. One thing I always tell employers, statistically, people with disabilities are the most loyal employees there are. we don't hop from job to job to job to job. We get the job done, and we make the place better. You know, but they're not going to learn that until, you know, as Q said, and as I said earlier, they are not mandated, but we don't want quotas. No one's asking for that, but adherence to reporting measures as to how well you're doing in increasing disability employment, or what barriers you're encountering, will be transformative. And, you know, as we can help businesses become more accessible through trainings, because quite often the solution to accessibility, which the business owner may be afraid to even look into, is really rather inexpensive. And because our community, and by community there, I mean our family, our friends, our coworkers, our, you know, fellow students, caregivers, etc. My opinion is, when you add that to the people with disabilities, we're the vast majority of Americans. We're certainly a big number, and there's no denying that. So anytime you hire a person with a disability, anytime you make your place accessible for people with disabilities, there are a huge number of non-disabled people will appreciate that and favor your business over the one that doesn't. So it's good business sense. And it is what we tried to do 30 years ago. But just like the Civil Rights Law of 1965 was not a cure-all, and everything that transpired since then is still going on, we just have to keep marching and pushing our issues, because we are totally intersectional. We're found in every single segment of society, in every nation in the world. And, you know, we have not been getting our due. The public advocate, a really strong exception to that rule, but so many elected officials, when they are enumerating all the marginalized communities they seek to protect, they don't mention people with disabilities. When they are rattling off the isms they're going to fight, classism, racism, sexism, do you ever hear ableism? So the more our elected officials, the more all conversations are inclusive of people with disabilities, the further we will benefit, and our benefit will be to the overall community's benefit.
Thank you for that, Mike. I really appreciate that. And, you know, we actually have literally 2 minutes left. So I do want to offer, if anyone else wants to make a very quick closing statement, and then I want to wrap and thank our teammates on this call and off our website. So anyone that want to make a very quick closing statement, and you can do so now.
This is the 70th anniversary of Disabled in Action, which is a social action organization that was founded in New York City. And I believe that between the activists in New York City and the partnership with the Public Advocate's Office, that this is going to be a kick-ass year of change. I'm really excited.
Thank you, Elisabeth. Marc, thank you.
I'm leaving it at that. Preach, Elisabeth. Preach. I'm with you.
I love it.
I would, real quickly, I'd just say that people with disabilities and their allies need to engage in the political process, where we're going to see change really happen. It has to come from government. That would, you know, instill greater values in business, in education, and everywhere else. So I'll make a shameless plug. Come and join us at 504 to fight for disability rights.
Thank you, Mike. Q, any last things?
Thank you. Thank you.
Thank you all.
Your team. And my
Great. So we have 1 minute left. I want to thank this entire panel. I want to thank our ASL interpreters, Jody Prysock and Nicole Cartania. I want to thank our captioner, Corey Dosty. I want to thank all of our team members in the Public Advocate's Office. This is but the first of several conversations, And, we're really going to be pushing hard on the legislative front as well. This isn't the beginning of the public advocates in our team's work, but this is us continuing to push toward equity, and we will do so with all of you. And the last thing I'll just add is you can check out our website at advocate.nyc.gov, or if you have an issue, you can email gethelp@advocate.nyc.gov. More to come, everyone. Thank you so much. I'm energized. I'm excited. We have room for optimism, reason for optimism. So let's get to work. Thanks, everybody. Have a great night.
Cheers.
Peace.